A series that called Wonder Women, in which we've been exploring, or in some cases, revisiting the stories of some incredible women from the Bible and drawing some meaningful application from them. In fact, for most of these stories, they're going to come from the Old Testament. But there's plenty of great women in the New Testament as well, but just so happens that most of these stories are from women in the Old Testament. And kind of doing this in honor of Mother's Day in May and my anniversary to a wonderful woman and so many other things. So today we are going to look at a woman whose story is very captivating. This story is full of tension, intrigue, clever maneuvering, irony, humor, poetic justice, and salvation, and not to mention many other things. And the story we're going to look at today is about a woman named Hadassah, but you might know her better by her Persian name, which is Esther, which means star, by the way. It's actually an offshoot of the name Ishtar, which was the Persian goddess of female and love. So she was renamed that Esther after that. But not only is there an entire book of the Old Testament dedicated to her story, but her action left a legacy that is still celebrated every year among Jews, even to this day. We're not going to read the entire story today, because it's like 8 or 9 chapters long, but I would encourage you to do that at a later time. For today, I'm just going to tell you the highlights and then draw a few verses from the story as we highlight a few takeaways. So that's kind of be our agenda. But you can follow along in the book of Esther if you want. Now, to give us a little backdrop, this story takes place near the end of the Old Testament period, chronologically speaking. So even though it's about the middle of the Old Testament, chronologically it actually takes place near the end of the Old Testament period. In fact, if we were to rearrange the Old Testament chronologically, it would probably be anywhere between the second to fourth book from the end. And the reason I say that is because many biblical scholars argue that her story takes place just a few years before the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah, while others say a few years after. So, this many years removed, it's a little hard to know for sure. But chances are her path crossed with Ezra and Nehemiah sometime. Now, the people of Israel by this time had already been set free from Babylonian captivity by Cyrus the Great, the king of the Medo-Persian Empire. By the way, for those who don't know, Persia is sort of the same thing as Iran is today. However, many chose to stay in Babylon or other cities that they had been set free from, just for any number of reasons. They had, basically kind of infiltrated into that society by now. We're 2-3 generations into their, when people tend to get transported to another area and they grow up in that area, they're just kind of used to it, and that's kind of what they're comfortable with. So maybe they stayed for that reason. Maybe they stayed there because they had elderly parents that couldn't make the journey back to Jerusalem. Who knows? But for whatever reason, many people stayed in Persia, while many others did go back to Jerusalem. Now, sitting on the throne of Persia at this time is a king by the name of Ahasuerus, or Ahasuerus. And that's how you pronounce it. The first 3 letters are AHA, like aha. But the rest of the name is it almost sounds like a dinosaur, Ahasuerus. But most likely referred to in secular history as Xerxes I, or Xerxes the First, and believed to be the grandson of Cyrus the Great. And like many 3rd and 4th generations of descendant, powerful, successful people, he seems a little bit under-equipped for the role, and maybe a little bit spoiled. He's impulsive, he's temperamental, he's vindictive, he's very easily influenced and manipulated by those closer to him. And the information that I just tell you, though, that information is valuable because ultimately this is who Esther will have to deal with at a very crucial moment with lives of hundreds of thousands of people on the line. Now, Ahasuerus had authority over 127 territories, including India and Israel and parts of Northeast Africa and some others. He's married to an extremely beautiful wife named Vashti, V-A-S-H-T-I, kind of like a trophy wife, basically. And as our story opens, Ahasuerus is throwing a party. In chapter 1, he's throwing a party that included his cabinet advisors, so to speak, his servants, and even all of the governors of the 127 territories that he rules over. And this party lasts for 6 months. Now that's a party, a 6-month-long party. But the real purpose for this party is basically for him to show off all of his wealth and his splendor. We know another person in the Bible who got in trouble for that, right? Remember Nebuchadnezzar? He was kind of showing off all his stuff, and God said, hey, you didn't do this, I did. All right, so but that's a different story altogether. But after this party, after this 6-month-long party, he decided to throw another one specifically for all those who lived in the town of Susa, which is kind of his winter home. This was his snowbird years, right? So he does his winter home in Susa. This one only lasted 7 days, but he breaks out all the fine china for the meals, and he declares an open bar for the entire week. Queen Vashti, in the meantime, is throwing a banquet for the women of the city, which is probably more like a tea party compared to the drunk fest going on with her husband. But during his party, Ahasuerus gets wasted. He just gets drunk off his mind. And one universal truth is that drunk men make for stupid men, right? and same thing with the drunk king. They make for stupid kings. Sometime during the party, Ahasuerus gets the bright idea to show off his trophy wife like she was just another one of his possessions, which in that time was not unusual. He instructs his servants, known as eunuchs, to go get her and to demand that she come over to his party and parade in front of his guests wearing her crown. However, she doesn't seem to take too kindly to this idea, to being treated like a piece of property, and she refuses. Now, today she would be celebrated for that kind of courage and fortitude. But this wasn't the 21st century, right? This was this decision to refuse, whether it be out of self-respect or out of embarrassment or modesty or some other reason. It was a bold move on her part to defy the king's orders. And as expected, he doesn't appreciate being disobeyed or disrespected or embarrassed in front of his guests. And remember, he's drunk, so that makes it all the more worse. So immediately he seeks advice from his cabinet as to what his legal rights are as king to deal with the situation. Now, wisely, they do not advise him to execute her, which they very well could have done. However, they are very concerned about how this whole action by Queen Vashti could affect their own marriages if there are no repercussions. If a woman in Vashti's position as a queen got away with defying her husband's orders, especially if he was the king, what in the world would their wives do if they didn't like what their husband demanded of them? They have to protect the patriarchy here and prevent a feminist uprising. So they advised him to strip her of her title, her position, her marriage, and even her home in the castle. And the drunk king agreed, and he signed a new law demanding that all the men of their household rule their household. And the thing about Persian law is once it's signed into law, it cannot be revoked, not even by the king himself. But before long, after the liquor wears off and the party dies down, Ahasuerus starts to realize the foolishness of his drunken decisions and the recklessness of it and the loneliness that comes with it. However, according to Persian law, he can't undo this. And even if he did, if he could, he would look foolish doing so. So once again, his advisors come up with another harebrained idea and suggest a contest by selecting women from every province to see who could win the king's favor and become his new bride and queen. Now, no doubt some of you have seen the TV show called The Bachelor, right? And you've all seen that when the women go on and, the guy gets to choose several different women and, and he hands the rose to whoever he chooses to go into the next round and so forth. So if you've never seen that, it's kind of a contest. The difference is that those women volunteer to be a part of that contest. That's not the case here in Persia. This is more along the lines of human trafficking. Women were selected from all over the kingdom, most likely against their wishes. Captivated or captured might be more like it. And at this point, when they are first captured or selected, they are taken to the first stop of the king's harems. Now, we might refer to this first stop as a spa, because when they get taken there, the women get to spend a year getting all kinds of beauty treatments and everything you can think of. They're just treated like royalty, which sounds really good at first. However, after that year, they are then sent to the king for, shall we say, an overnight stay. Right? He basically gets to test the goods, so to speak. The hope of every young woman is that she would be selected to be the new queen. However, there was only one first place in this so-called contest, and nothing redeeming about losing. If he didn't choose her to be his queen after that night, they were then sent to a second harem, which we might as well call the barn. Because like barnyard animals, when they were sent there, it meant that they were nothing more than basically a piece of meat to the king. They became a concubine, to be used at the king's pleasure with no say in the matter. Now, one of these ladies selected for the spa was our heroine of our story, Esther. She had a rough start in life. She was born into a culture in which her parents and family members had been captured and deported from their home into a foreign land. She was born at a time when females were considered second-class objects. In addition, she lost both of her parents at a very young age, and she was eventually adopted or raised by an older cousin by the name of Mordecai. However, he does have a profound impact and influence on her. Even in adulthood, she still follows his lead. Now she has been drafted into this harem, and she will be forced to have sex with a careless king and may never get to live a normal married life. So this is the rough way of life. However, much like Joseph in Egypt and Daniel in Babylon, God seems to cause her to be favored by those that she comes into contact with. And the servant in charge of the spa takes a very keen liking to her. Something about her demeanor, maybe her humility, maybe her submissiveness, or something else gets his attention. And from the get-go, he gives her all of the advantages that he can. The best room in the spa, the best cosmetician to kind of help her with her beauty treatments, and even a special diet just for her. She's clearly his favorite to get chosen by the king. Now finally, it is her time after a year to go into the king for her overnight stay. And for reasons we are never told, she wins the favor of the king and she is selected to be his queen. And as a result, a huge party is thrown in her honor. Now throughout all this, Esther never reveals her heritage or her relationship with Mordecai. She never tells the king that she is a Jew. And Mordecai is her cousin. And Mordecai apparently works in close proximity with the king in some way, because as some type of judge over civil matters or something, because it put them in a position to be able to hear and see and witness certain things and to be able to communicate with certain people of the palace. And there's a lot of excitement going on, and we're not in so far in this book, and we're not even into chapter 2 yet. That's just chapter 1. Now we go into chapter 2. Mordecai discovered that 2 of the king's special servants are plotting to assassinate the king. He tells Esther, who then relays it to the king. The king investigates. He calls for an investigation, and he finds that the accusation to be true, and he executes the men, but he forgets to reward Mordecai for his work, or for his help in doing so. Now, from this point, we jump about 5 years later in the story, 5 years later in history. In that time, a new cabinet member comes upon the scene by the name of Haman, who has risen to the second highest position in the entire kingdom. He's basically the right-hand guy for King Ahasuerus. However, it becomes very obvious in the story that he's not very well liked or respected by everyone else for reasons we don't really know. But one thing that is also very obvious is that Mordecai definitely cannot stand him. He refuses, every time he sees him, he refuses to bow. He refuses to show the proper respect for someone in Haman's position by not bowing to him. Now, it could be for religious reasons or for whatever, but for whatever reason, he does not bow to him, he does not respect him. And this really eats at Haman. He lives for the honor that he feels that should be shown to him. He becomes obsessed with it, almost like a guy who gets obsessed over the one girl that won't pay any attention to him, if you know what I mean. You see that in high school. It's like, all the girls the guy can have, or vice versa, and the one they become obsessed about, the one that doesn't show him any attention. Same idea here. To retaliate, instead of just dealing with Mordecai directly, Haman decides to use his power and his influence to declare an empire-wide annihilation of all of the Jews. He said, I'm not just going to punish one man, I'm going to punish them all. Now this is either just to show Mordecai that he's going to do more than just punish him, or it's because he judges an entire group of people based on the actions of one man. We don't really know why, but nevertheless, this is what he's decided to do. So he gets his posse together and he formulates a plan before going to the king. They roll the dice or they cast the lot, which was also called pur, P-U-R. They cast the lot and to carry out this mass extermination. They determine a date by doing that, which comes out to the 12th month, the 13th day of the 12th month. So in our calendar, it would be like December 13th, and they're more like March. With all the plans in motion, Haman goes to the king to tell him that he wants to eradicate a certain group of people, but he never specifies who the people are, nor does the king even ask. He just kind of gives them the power to do it. Haman even offered to cover the cost by offering 10,000 talents of silver, which is the equivalent of about 750,000 pounds of silver. And needless to say, he's not hurting for money. Mordecai hears about this plan, and he immediately goes into mourning. In the Jewish way, he dresses in sackcloth and ashes, and he puts himself on full display in the middle of the town, crying out loud day and night. Eventually, the word gets around to all the Jews throughout the empire what is going to happen, and they too change into mourning clothes, into not M-O-R-N-I-N-G, but sadness mourning clothes. Interestingly enough, Esther doesn't know anything about it at this point, which kind of just gives you an idea of how sheltered she is from the day-to-day operations of the kingdom. But when she discovered that Mordecai, what he's doing, that he's the one out there making all that noise, she begins a series of messages by courier to him and with him. And as a result, she concludes that she has no choice but to risk her life going before the king, even without being summoned, which would have been a death sentence, and see if he can somehow stop this from happening. She calls for a fast and a prayer among the Jewish people, 3 days and 3 nights. She tells Mordecai, tell all the rest of the Jews, don't eat, don't drink, anything. Just fast and pray for 3 days. Eventually, after all that, she decided to make her move. She makes her way to the king. And when the king sees her, instead of getting angry and calling for her execution, he offers to fulfill whatever request she has. And her request, first of all, is that he allow her to throw a dinner party for just her and himself and his buddy Haman, his right-hand guy who's causing all this problem. And on the night of that dinner party, things appear to go pretty well. But for some reason, Esther isn't quite ready to spill her gut and ask about what the whole thing's about, so she asked for a second dinner the following night. Now, the story doesn't tell us why she decided to wait an extra night. Maybe she just kind of wants to feel out the situation. Maybe she wants to use the first banquet to observe the dynamics of this relationship between the king and Haman to see what she's really getting into here. Obviously, Haman had some type of influence over the king, so maybe she's just looking for a weakness, or a weak spot, or a missing element that she could exploit. Maybe she was using the second banquet idea as a test to see if the king would grant one request before agreeing to a major decision. Maybe she was hoping for a certain flow of conversation, looking for the right opening, and maybe just didn't see it. Maybe she was just working Haman a little bit to break him down, whatever defenses he might have had. But whatever it is, whatever the reason is, that obviously seemed to work because the text tells us that he was on cloud 9 when he left the first banquet that night, knowing that he was invited back to a second banquet with just him and the king and the queen, feeling pretty important, right? And no way would he be expecting, though, for what was coming the next night. But as he leaves the palace that night, he runs across Mordecai, his archenemy, who still refuses to show him respect, and that ticks him off again. He's kind of back and forth on his emotions here. But he lets it go for the moment. He gets home and he calls his family together and his buddies together, and he starts bragging about how great his life is. Second in charge of the largest empire in the world, private dinners with the king and queen 2 nights in a row, more wealth than he knows what to do with, 10 sons to pass on his legacy to, and much more. I mean, he's just like enjoying his life. He's just bragging on his life. But he still can't get over Mordecai's contempt. So his wife, in an effort to make him happy, suggests that he build an elaborate gallows 50 foot high in which to execute Mordecai, and then go to the king first thing in the morning and get his permission to do it. To kind of just help her husband take care of this guy once and for all. And then he'll really have a reason to celebrate at the second dinner. Well, Haman loved the plan, and he and his buddies work all night to set up these gallows. In the meantime, that very same night, the king cannot sleep. So he calls in for one of his servants to read him some of the highlights of his years as king in order to kind of calm his nerves and maybe put him to sleep. I don't know about you, but if I pull out a good book at nighttime, I might get 2 pages and I'm gone, okay? I mean, that's just the way I am. Maybe that's what he's doing here. And it just so happens that one of the sections that the servant decides to read about is about the time Mordecai had saved the king's life 5 years earlier, and discovers that he never properly rewarded Mordecai. I don't know about you, but I don't think that's a mistake. I don't think that's a coincidence. God has a way of bringing things back around even when we've long forgotten. Now, some people might read this part of the story, again, and call that a coincidence, but I think you and I both know better. When you walk with God long enough, you begin to realize when certain incidents happen and that things appear to just fall into place, it is more than just coincidence, right? It's providence. And that's a big part of this story, the providence of God, working out all things for the good of those who love him. Now, by this time, it must be early morning, because just as the king is discovering that he never honored Mordecai properly, Haman walks in and chomping at the bit to ask permission to execute the very same person that he's celebrating, or that he's wanting to celebrate. And before Mordecai can get a word in, the king says, Haman, what should I do for someone that I'm really pleased with and wish to honor? Haman, of course, he's thinking the king's talking about me, right? So I'm going to give him the best, right? I'm going to give him the best idea I can think of. He immediately tells them that in order to honor someone, that what he should do is let the man ride on one of his royal horses, wearing one of his royal robes, with a high-ranking nobleman escorting him and singing his praises throughout the streets, making it look really good, because he's envisioning himself on top of this horse. In other words, let the man be treated like a king for a day. Then, in a very hilarious twist in the story, the king tells Haman to do that for Mordecai. I just love the irony and the humor in this, right? I mean, I would have loved to have seen the look on Mordecai or on Haman's face at that moment. We talked this morning about how when your words come back to haunt you, this is one of those situations. And you can imagine the satisfaction that Mordecai is having, enjoying this every time Haman has to sing his praises while being escorted by him. The guy who hates them, is actually having to escort him through the town. And I can almost see all the other nobles were getting the biggest kick out of this. He's not going to live this down. But needless to say, Haman is thoroughly embarrassed. He feels degraded, and he goes home angry as a hornet again. And he tells the entire story to his wife. And his wife, ever the encourager, and says, "You're in trouble now. This is not good news." And so, not very encouraging from your own wife. You got to love that. But about that time, the king's servants show up to escort him to the second dinner with the king and queen. Now that might have made him feel better for the moment, but if he thought his morning and his afternoon were rough, wait till what happens next. It's about to get a whole lot worse. Shortly after the dinner began, the king once again asked Esther what it is that she would like the king to do. And this time, probably being fully aware of the day's events, she wastes no time. She tells the king that someone has manipulated him into calling for the execution of her people, as well as herself. And when the king asked who would dare do such a thing, she points to Haman and she says, "That evil man." Can you imagine being in that room? Oh man, I would love to be a fly on the wall in that room. And as a result, the king calls, a couple other things happen, but as a result, the king calls for Haman's immediate execution on the very gallows that he had built and prepared for Mordecai the night before. The king eventually gives all of Haman's property and all of his belongings to Esther, who in turn gives them to Mordecai. And the king promotes Mordecai to Haman's old position as the second most powerful man in the kingdom. What a story, huh? This is a movie. It's almost like a movie. However, there's still one problem. The annihilation of the Jews is still scheduled to be carried out, and that law cannot change. You can't just say, "Oh, forget that law." It doesn't happen that way. So to counteract it, a new law is made that on the day that the extermination is supposed to begin, the Jews had the equal right to defend themselves and kill anyone who would still want to attack them. Fortunately, most of the persons did not want to hurt them anyway. Many, in fact, joined the Jews, including some of the nobles and the soldiers. Still, there were some who tried to take advantage of the opportunity to kill the Jews, only to find themselves on the wrong end of a sword. And as a result, that day, the Jews killed over 75,000 enemies over a 2-day period in self-defense. God gave them a great victory. And as a result, Mordecai and Esther declared a brand new holiday that is still celebrated today, 2,500 years later, called the Feast of Purim. It's celebrated very much like we celebrate Christmas, giving gifts to one another and to the less fortunate, and eating meals together as a family. In fact, this year, it actually happened on, I think it was March 13th through the 15th of this year. So it's still celebrated today, which is a great proof of the truth of this story. Now that's the story of Esther. But again, I want to encourage you to read through the book to get even more details. But for the rest of our time, I want to draw our attention to the most familiar passage in the story of Esther and to what I believe is the most important takeaway from this story. And the passage I want to center our focus on is found in Esther chapter 4, verse 14 through 16. At this point, the king has signed off on Haman's plan to exterminate the Jews. Mordecai realizes that the most logical solution to this dilemma is to ask his own cousin that he raised, the queen, to attempt to go to the king and plead for mercy. However, in that culture and time, a person couldn't just walk into the king without being called, not even the queen. They could be executed for doing that. Ahasuerus has already shown that he can be very temperamental, and Esther reveals that the king had not requested her presence for a month at this point. And here's what the scripture says. Upon hearing this message from Esther, Mordecai sends this response back. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from somewhere else, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this. Then Esther sent this reply back to Mordecai, "Go and gather all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maid and I will do the same, and then though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king, and if I must die, I must die." What a courageous statement, huh? Now we might first hear this and read this, and our first thought might be that Mordecai is kind of laying a guilt trip on her to attempt a life-threatening solution to a problem that really he helped create because of his refusal to bow down to Haman. But at this point, we're way past the sign and blame. And truthfully speaking, he's not wrong to think that of all the people who could convince the king to reconsider, she has the best chance. She might be the only one. And like all of us at one time or another, Esther is drawn into a situation that she did not create, she did not cause, she did not choose to be a part of. In fact, that seemed to be the story of her life. She got a raw deal in her childhood. She lost her parents at an early age, like I already mentioned. She basically got kidnapped and forced into a competition she didn't volunteer for, and now this. And in spite of all that, Mordecai's challenge makes for a very profound observation, and that is this. It's not the life you were born into or the circumstances that you are subjected to by others against your will that determine who you are or what you do at the critical moments in your life. A lot of people use the way they're raised or brought up as an excuse to act a certain way, this way or that way. They choose to be a victim. Your life is a story, my life is a story, and we all have a story to tell. And yes, unfortunately, some of those stories are sadder than others. Some are extremely unfair on a human scale compared to others. However, it is entirely up to us how we choose to frame that story or how we choose to respond to it. We can choose to be a victim and we can cry, woe is me, all our life. And I know people that do that. Or we can choose to see our story in the grand design of God's story by asking God to redeem us, or to redeem our life and our story for His purposes. Being dealt a raw deal in your childhood or being drafted into a situation you can't control does not prevent us from being used for greatness. Mordecai suggests that the providence of God had led Esther to this very moment by asking her to consider the option that perhaps she was born for such a moment and made queen for such a time, for this very purpose, to stand in the gap at a very critical time in history. God in His providential wisdom knew long before this that Esther would be standing in the middle of this moment. And possibly, just possibly, all of the events that led Esther to this point, all the suffering that she had to go through, had prepared her to be in the position that she was in. Maybe this was by God's design, or at least He allowed it to happen. The question, however, is, would she step into the moment? Would she stand in the moment? Or would she shrink and shrivel away from it? Like Esther, at some point, we all find ourselves in moments or circumstances that we didn't create, we didn't cause, nor did we purposely choose to be in, but we have the option to stand and step into the moment. You don't get to choose the culture you're born into or you're subjected to when you're young, but you do get to choose how you respond to them. And how we choose to respond makes all the difference in the world, especially if you choose to believe that God can redeem you from those things. We can choose the path of bitterness, or we can choose the path of blame. We can choose the path of redemption by recognizing that God has the capacity and willingness to redeem our story for His purpose, and that in those circumstances He has been preparing us to do something that only we can do because of the things we had to go through. And the only thing that matters in those moments is whether or not we will stand in and step into the moment. To do so takes great courage. Esther answered this challenge by first making the decision to step into the moment. And then she did the one thing that makes sense in moments like this. She called for a total concentration of prayer and reflecting and even fasting. And collectively, these things are an invitation to God to give us a clear plan of action and the supernatural courage to take the next step forward. She threw caution to the wind. She made a plan and she acted upon it. Each step was difficult. It was risky and probably very nerve-wracking. But she alone stood in the gap between those who had no hope and the one who could give them hope. She alone had the opportunity to wield the kind of influence that would change the future for the rest of her Jewish relatives. And by following through, she helped give the people a new reason to celebrate and give glory to God. And today I challenge each of us to see our own life story within the grand design of God's story and ask ourselves this question: has God been preparing me or you for such a time as this, or for such a circumstance as the one you find yourself in? Or has God been preparing you for such a church as this? Is there something that God wants to leverage from our stories, from our experiences, from the way we were raised, from the things that we learned, from all the good things that have happened to us and the bad things that have happened to us? Is there something that God wants to redeem from all that prepares us uniquely to stand in the gap and fill only what we can fill? Does God want to redeem our story, to give hope to those who are deeply lacking in hope? It takes faith to say yes to those questions. It takes courage, it takes prayer, and sometimes fasting to help us say yes in those moments. If we fail, we fail. Or as Esther surmised in her circumstances, if we perish, we perish. For even then I believe that God can and will redeem it for a greater purpose. Amen? Let's pray.